The gavel came down before Elena Voss finished her sentence, and that was the first lie of the day. "Motion carries," said the Assembly Speaker, at age rushing with her throat sacs that flexed pink with satisfaction. "Soul system and all associated biological assets are reclassified under Founding Compact Annex 9, effective immediately." Elena did not stand. She did not raise her voice, did not slam a hand on the podium the way the human delegate from the old broadcasts always did in hegemony propaganda reels. She simply folded her hands and watched 211 delegates from 43 species erupt into the low, oscillating hum that passed for applause in a chamber built for lungs that didn't work like human lungs. 3 floors below the debate hall, on the Kestrel Vigil, Sergeant First Class Tomas Reyes felt the ship shudder before anyone said a word. "That's not turbulence," he said, already moving. Colonel Marcus Adeyemi didn't look up from the tactical display. Confirming. Reyes's boots hit the deck plating hard enough to rattle the loose bolt near frame 11, the one maintenance had promised to fix 3 deployments ago. Red light bled across the corridor. Not alarm red. Docking clamp red. "Colonel!" "Something's mating to our hull." Up in the chamber, Elena watched High Chancellor Vestalerin rise from the hegemony block with the unhurried grace of a species that had never once lost a vote it called. His robes, layered in deliberate redundancy, the way Killian architecture layered armor, caught the chamber light in slow ripples. "Ambassador Voss." His translator voice carried warm condescension, the tone of a man delivering bad news to a child he still liked. "You've said nothing this entire session." "I've been listening," Elena said. "To what end? The vote is decided. Your world status changes. Your fleets, your orbital assets, your—" He paused, savoring it. "Your Kestrel Vigil, currently docked at Assembly Ring 7, is now hegemony property under Annex 9, subsection 3. Repossession teams are already attaching." That was when Vera Vance, seated behind Elena with a stack of physical printouts nobody in this chamber had used in 2 centuries, went very still. "Subsection 3, Vera whispered, not to Elena, to herself, flipping pages with the specific fury of a woman who had read this document backward at 3 a.m. for 6 years running. "Subsection 3 requires ratification confirmation from the originating delegate before asset transfer executes." Elena stood. The chamber's noise dropped like a hell breath. "Chancellor," she said, and her voice did not rise, did not crack, did not do any of the things 200 delegates were braced for. "You're executing repossession before ratification confirmation. That's a procedural violation." Thalerin's throat sac pulsed once, amused. "A technicality your species is welcome to file a grievance over, in perhaps 11 cycles. Meanwhile, my teams are already aboard your vessel. On the Kestrel Vigil, they were—" Reyes hit the corridor junction at a dead run, sidearm drawn but low, finger indexed off the trigger the way 11 years of doctrine had beaten into his spine. 3 hegemony enforcement drones, squat, 6-legged, armor-plated things built for boarding actions against species that fought back with brute force, clanked to the outer airlock in a formation too tight for corridor's width. That was the first mistake. Reyes clocked it in half a second. "Colonel, they've breached with a 3-unit wedge in a corridor rated for 2 abreast." "Copy. Let them jam themselves." Adeyemi's voice stayed flat over the comm, the flatness of a man who had learned patience the hard way. Twice, in places he didn't talk about. "Do not engage. Repeat, do not engage." Reyes hated that order with every cell in his body and obeyed it anyway. The lead drone's forward manipulator arm swung out, magnetic clamp whirring, and closed on empty air where a human soldier should have been standing his ground. Reyes had already backed through a bulkhead hatch and sealed it behind him, a hatch rated for a hull breach. Not for keeping out a drone, but the drone didn't know that. Because the drone's targeting profile, Vera could have told him, was built entirely on 3 centuries of hegemony annexation footage. Species that fought, species that fled, species that surrendered. Nothing in that library had a category for a species that simply waited. Back in the chamber, Elena felt the weight of 211 sets of alien eyes and kept her hands folded. "Chancellor," she said, "you should know that the Kestrel Vigil's crew has standing orders not to resist boarding." A ripple of translated laughter, several dialects overlapping into a discordant chord that hurt to listen to. "How very civilized," Dalaran said. "I confess, Ambassador, I expected more fight from your people. Your species has quite the reputation in our intelligence briefings. Aggressive, unpredictable, and yet—" He gestured at the silent chamber, at her folded hands. "Here you stand, letting us take what's ours." "It isn't yours yet," Elena said. "Subsection 3, Dalaran said, waving a hand as though swatting an insect, "is a formality my legal office will resolve retroactively. Possession, Ambassador, in the hegemony's long experience, becomes law faster than law becomes law." Vera's pen stopped moving. She looked up at Elena with an expression that, translated out of 6 years of shared exhausted late nights, meant he just said the quiet part out loud, on record, in front of the entire assembly. 3 decks below, the second wave of drones hit the Kestrel Vigil's reactor access corridor and stopped. "Colonel," Reyes said, voice tight, watching the feed from a maintenance camera he'd bolted there himself 2 tours ago against 3 separate regulations. "They're not moving toward the bridge. They're moving toward engineering." Adeyemi's jaw worked once. "They're not here to seize a ship." "Then what?" "They're here to seize the reactor core specs." Adeyemi finally looked up from the display, and for the first time that day something moved behind his eyes that wasn't patience. "Reyes, what's behind bulkhead 11, the one you just sealed?" Reyes felt his stomach drop through the deck plating. "The auxiliary access shaft," he said slowly, "that we welded shut in dry dock. The one that isn't on any registered schematic." "Correct." Adeyemi keyed a channel that didn't route through the ship's standard comm array, a hard line, physically separate, the kind of system that had gone out of fashion 300 years ago because it was slow and ugly and impossible to hack from outside a hull. "Get to it before they cut through that weld. If they get eyes on what's down there before we're ready." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Above them, in the chamber, Elena Voss watched High Chancellor Vestalaran smile at his own reflection in the polished obsidian podium, utterly certain he had already won, and heard, through a small earpiece nested against her skull, 3 words from Colonel Adeyemi that made her fold her hands a fraction tighter. They found bulkhead 11. The cutting torch bit into bulkhead 11 at 400 degrees hotter than the weld was rated for, and Tomas Reyes heard it through the metal before he saw the spark bloom on the other side. "Colonel!" There through the outer plate. He backed against the far wall of the narrow access corridor, sidearms still holstered, hands empty and raised the way doctrine demanded when contact was imminent and unavoidable. His heart was doing something ugly in his chest. He counted it anyway. 4 beats. 5, 6. An old habit from BUD/S he'd never managed to shake. Counting things down to nothing. "I'm not engaging." "Good man." Adeyemi's voice carried none of the strain Reyes felt in his own hands. "Stay clear of the breach radius. Let them open it." "Sir, with respect, once they're through," Adeyemi said, "they'll see a maintenance shaft with a coolant manifold and 11 years of dust. That's all that's down there today." Reyes frowned. "Today, sir?" Adeyemi didn't answer. He was already keying a second channel, one that didn't touch the ship's network at all, a physical relay buried in the keel, splicing during a refit that never made it onto any public maintenance log. 3 words went out on that line, encoded in a burst so short it barely registered as a transmission at all. "Cascade. Hold. 0. Up in the assembly chamber, Vera Vance was building her case sentence by sentence, the way she built everything, brick over brick, with no shortcuts. "Chancellor Thallerin," she said, standing now beside Elena, Annex 9, subsection 3, as ratified in the Third Compact Revision, states explicitly that repossession of contested biological world assets cannot commence until the originating delegate confirms ratification in open session. That confirmation has not occurred. It cannot occur, under subsection 3A, until 72 standard hours after the vote, a cooling period written into the law specifically prevent. She paused, letting the chamber's translators catch up, letting the words land in 43 languages at once. Specifically to prevent exactly what your enforcement teams are doing right now. Thallerin's four throat sacs flexed, and for the first time that day, the motion wasn't quite as languid as before. "An oversight," he said, easily corrected. "It's not an oversight if you knew the clause existed," Elena said quietly. "And I think you did." The chamber's ambient hum shifted. Subtly, the way a room full of predators shifts when they realize the prey isn't running. Several delegates from smaller, newer member species, the Tashi cluster representative, a spindle creature with compound eyes that hadn't blinked once during the session, leaned forward in their seats. Thallerin recovered fast. Elena had to give him that. The hegemony's legal office will review the timeline. In the interim, our teams will simply pause at the threshold of any sensitive system. No harm done. 3 decks below, that pause did not arrive. The cut plate fell inward, and the lead drone's optical sensor swept the narrow shaft beyond bulkhead 11. Dust, a coolant manifold. Service ladder rungs corroded green with age. Exactly what Adeyemi promised. The drone's targeting logic, built on 3 centuries of annexation footage, filed the space under non-threat, low priority, and began advancing its 2 companions through the breach to widen it. That was the second mistake. Reyes watched it happen and understood, with the sick clarity of a man watching a trap spring on someone else, that Adeyemi had wanted him to see exactly this and nothing more. "Sir," Reyes murmured into his throat mic, so quiet it barely registered his speech. "There's nothing down there." "There's nothing down there today," Adeyemi said again, and this time there was something in his voice, not quite a smile, that Reyes had heard exactly twice before in 11 years, both times right before something very bad happened to people who weren't wearing an Earth uniform. Up in the chamber, the Tashi delegate's translator crackled to life. Unprompted, its 4-note vocalization rendering into flat assembly standard. "Chancellor Thallerin, a question, if the human ambassador will permit." Elena inclined her head. "Go ahead." "If the repossession is procedurally void," the Tashi delegate said, compound eyes swiveling toward Thallerin with a tension that hadn't been there a minute ago, "does the hegemony's continued boarding action constitute an act of unauthorized incursion against a sovereign system? Because my cluster's compact to the assembly," it continued, each word deliberate, "explicitly withdraws support from any member found in violation of Annex 9's cooling provisions." The chamber's hum changed pitch again. Elena kept her hands folded and did not let herself feel the small, cold satisfaction blooming in her chest, because Vera had warned her 3 years ago, over stale coffee in a windowless prep room. The moment you let them see you enjoying it, they'll stop being embarrassed and start being angry, and angry is worse. Thallerin's translator voice, when it came, had lost its warmth entirely. "The boarding action will complete," he said. "Legal technicalities will be resolved after the fact, as they always are. Ambassador Voss's restraint changes nothing. Humanity has no fleet capable of contesting this vote. No weapon in your arsenal that our intelligence hasn't already cataloged 3 times over. You are, and have always been, a footnote species that talks well." "You cataloged our weapons," Elena said, exhaustively. "Then you know exactly what we don't have." She let that sentence sit in the chamber for 1 full second, 2, the silence stretching taut as cable. Chancellor, has it occurred to you that a species smart enough to write law your legal office still hasn't fully parsed after 6 years might also be smart enough to hide something from a cataloging effort built entirely around counting things that go bang? Thallerin opened his mouth to answer. He never got the chance. 3 decks below, the second drone crossed the threshold of bulkhead 11, its rear manipulator brushing a section of the shaft wall that had, until that exact moment, read as solid corroded plating on every scan the hegemony possessed, and the wall folded inward like it had never been a wall at all. Reyes's throat mic caught the sound of his own breath stopping. "Colonel," he said, "it's opening." Adeyemi's reply carried down the hard line in 3 flat words, and for the first time that day, Reyes heard something underneath the colonel's calm that might, in a lesser man, have been called excitement. Let open. The wall didn't reveal a weapon. It revealed a mirror, and for 3 full seconds the lead drone's optical sensor simply reflected its own armored chassis back at itself, feeding its threat assessment routine a loop of pure nothing. Reyes almost laughed. He caught himself before it left his throat, because laughing in a breached corridor with 2 hegemony drones 18 feet away was the kind of thing that got a man killed by his own nerves. "Colonel," he whispered, "it's a mirror, a literal mirror." "Polished tantalum composite panel," Adeyemi corrected, not whispering at all, his voice carrying particular flatness of a man reciting a spec sheet he'd memorized against his will. "Reflects across 94% of the hegemony's standard optical bands. Their drones scan for shapes, thermal signatures, structural anomalies. They don't scan for their own reflection, because no species in 300 years of annexation footage has ever bothered hiding something behind a mirror. Why would they? A mirror doesn't stop a weapon. It's not there to stop a weapon." Adeyemi's tone shifted half a degree, and Reyes, 11 years reading this man's silences, understood that whatever came next mattered more than anything said so far. It's there to buy 4 seconds of confusion in a targeting loop that resolves visual ambiguity by defaulting to ignore. 4 seconds is what Cascade needs. What's Cascade? Adeyemi didn't answer. Down the shaft, past the drone's confused hesitation, something in the false wall's recessed housing began to warm. Not visibly, not audibly, but Reyes felt it the way you feel a stove across a kitchen before you've touched it, a change in the air pressing against the side of his face. Up in the chamber, Chancellor Thallerin was fighting a battle of his own and losing in front of 211 delegates who had spent 6 years watching him win. "The Tashi cluster's objection," he said, each word measured now, careful, "is noted and will be addressed through standard grievance channels." "Standard grievance channels," the Tashi delegate repeated, its 4-note vocalization flattening into something almost mocking to the translator. "Take, by assembly record, an average of 140 cycles to resolve. My cluster will not remain complicit in an active violation for 140 cycles, Chancellor. We withdraw provisional support, effective this session." A second voice joined it. The Vashta trade envoy, a species Elena had exchanged exactly 4 sentences within 6 years of sessions, none of them substantive. The Vashta compact echoes this position. Elena kept her hands folded. Vera, beside her, had gone very still in the specific way of a woman watching a structure she'd spent years building finally bear weight. Thallerin's throat sacs pulsed rapid now. No languor left them at all. This is a procedural footnote being weaponized into theater. "It's not theater, Chancellor," Elena said. "It's the 72-hour cooling period your legal office chose not to enforce, being enforced by everyone else in this room instead. That was when the alarm hit the chamber's secondary display. Not Elena's doing, not Vera's. A raw data feed patched in from Ring 7's docking authority, visible to every delegate present. Kestrel Vigil. Unauthorized system activation detected. Source unclassified." Thallerin's head snapped toward the display, and for one unguarded instant, Elena saw something under the condescension that she recognized instantly because she'd worn the same expression once, 20 years ago, in a negotiation that had gone sideways in the last 4 minutes after seeming one for the first 4 hours. "Doubt, Ambassador," Thalarin said, quieter now, "what is your vessel doing?" "I don't have operational visibility into Colonel Adeyemi's tactical decisions," Elena said, and it was technically true. She genuinely didn't know what Cascade was, only that it existed, buried in a briefing she'd signed off on without full red access 18 months ago, back when Quiet Fire Protocol was still 3 sentences in a classified annex she hadn't been cleared to open completely. "That's rather the point of a chain of command, Chancellor. I don't tell my colonel how to do his job, and he doesn't tell me how to do mine." 3 decks below, the warming housing behind the false wall reached whatever threshold it had been built to reach and released. Not an explosion. Reyes braced for one and didn't get one. Instead, a fine mist, pressurized, near invisible, carrying a faint mineral tang he'd never smelled before, vented into the shaft in the control pulse, and both drones' chassis mid-advance simply stopped moving. "Colonel!" Reyes stared at the 2 motionless drones, their optical sensors still lit, still active, but their legs frozen mid-stride like insects caught in amber. "They're not dead. They're not powered down. They're just stuck." "Ferrofluid particulate," Adeyemi said, and now, finally, Reyes heard the satisfaction he'd been listening for since the corridor first shuddered. "Suspended in a carrier gel that solidifies on contact with their joint lubricant, doesn't touch the electronics, doesn't trip a weapon's fire alert on their sensors, because by every metric their own systems track, nothing fired. No kinetic signature, no energy discharge, no casualty. Then what did we just do?" "We proved a legal point," Adeyemi said. "Their drones are now physically incapable of completing repossession of restricted compartments. Through mechanical failure, not combat action. No treaty violation on our end. No ground for escalation on theirs." "And Reyes?" The colonel's voice dropped, and Reyes realized, with a chill that had nothing to do with the shaft's temperature, that the colonel had been building toward this single sentence since the first drone crossed the outer threshold. That's the smallest tool in that housing. "Cascade has 4 more stages. We just used stage 1. In the chamber." The secondary display refreshed, and a new line of text scrolled across it in assembly standard, visible to all 211 delegates simultaneously. "Hegemony Enforcement Units 7 and 9. Mechanical failure. Cause undetermined. No weapons discharge recorded. No Earth forces engaged." Thalarin read it twice. Elena watched him read it twice. Watched the exact moment he understood that Earth had done something to 2 of his drones without triggering a single alert his own systems were built to catch, and had done it so cleanly the record itself would defend her. "Ambassador Voss," he said, and his translator voice had lost every trace of warmth it had carried at the session's opening. "I want a full accounting of what just happened aboard your vessel." "I'll ask the colonel to file a maintenance report," Elena said. "I imagine it will say exactly what your own sensors are already telling you. Mechanical failure. Nothing more. You expect this assembly to accept that." "I expect this assembly," Elena said, "to accept the same standard of evidence it accepted 6 minutes ago, when you told us subsection 3 was a technicality." The chamber went very quiet, and in that quiet, Vera Vance leaned close to Elena's ear and murmured for words that weren't in any brief, any protocol, any rehearsed line, just a plain, exhausted satisfaction of a lawyer watching her citation land exactly where she'd aimed it 6 years ago. "He doesn't know Cascade." She was wrong, because at that exact moment, in the private channel reserved for Hegemony Command Staff, a priority alert flagged on Thalarin's personal display. Not from his enforcement drones, but from Hegemony Fleet Intelligence, 3 systems away, reporting an anomaly in the long-range sensor sweep of Sol System itself. Something in the outer belt had just activated on a frequency their entire 3-century archive had no record of ever seeing humans use. Falarin stared at the message. Then, for the first time in 6 years, High Chancellor Vestalarin's hand, visible to the entire chamber, began to tremble. High Chancellor Thalarin's hand remained frozen over his display. The tremor was faint, a mere twitch of the tendon, but in a chamber where 211 delegates were watching his every micro-expression, it looked like a structural collapse. Chancellor? The Tashi delegate's voice was an itch in silence. Is there a breakdown in communication with your fleet? Thalarin didn't answer. He was staring at the telemetry. The frequency coming from Sol System wasn't a weapon lock. It wasn't a distress call. It was a rhythmic pulse, a ping, a sonar check. Humanity had just turned the entire Sol System into a sensor array, and they were echoing it back at the hegemony's home cluster. Ambassador! Thalarin hissed, his translator voice cracking, shedding the polished facade of the high-ranking diplomat. That pulse, that is a direct breach of the deep space navigation treaties. You are pinging the core sectors with unauthorized high-energy bursts. Elena didn't move. She didn't blink. She felt Vera's presence behind her, a steady anchoring heat. We are conducting a long-overdue system audit, Chancellor. It seems we've been miscalculating the reach of our own sensors for quite some time. It is an act of aggression. Thalarin slammed his hand on the podium. The obsidian surface rippled, a visual representation of his failing composure. I am invoking the emergency security protocol. Hegemony fleets in the sector are authorized to engage any human asset displaying anomalous activity. You can't, Vera said, her voice cutting to the hall like a razor. It wasn't loud, but it possessed the authority of a woman who had spent 6 years waiting for this exact intersection of events. Annex 9, subsection 3, specifically forbids unauthorized fleet mobilization during a cooling period. If you engage the Kestrel Vigil or any human-originating signal, you are not just in violation of a treaty. You are in active breach of the founding compact. The entire assembly will be legally required to sanction you. Thalarin's throat sacs turned a deep, bruised purple. He was trapped in the very cage he had designed for humanity. If he stopped, he looked weak. If he attacked, he forfeited the entire legal basis of his empire. 3 decks below, on the Kestrel Vigil, Reyes was staring at the auxiliary shaft. The 2 drones were still frozen, but the mist, that strange mineral-smelling particulate, was beginning to seep into the floor plates. Colonel, Reyes whispered, his voice hitching. The particulate, it's not just jamming the drones. It's reacting with the ship's hull. The metal, it's turning gray. Stage 2, Adeyemi replied over the hard line. Don't touch it, Reyes. That's not a malfunction. That's the cascade starting to digest the hegemony's proprietary alloy. They built their tech to withstand lasers and railguns, not molecular debonding at a microscopic level. They're going to realize what's happening to the ship, sir. They're going to know it's not a mechanical failure. Let them, Adeyemi said. By the time they realize it, the Kestrel won't be a ship anymore. It'll be a cloud of nanite hungry rust drifting into their intake manifolds. Up in the chamber, Elena Voss finally leaned forward. She looked Thalarin dead in his compound eyes. Chancellor, you have 2 choices. You can pull your teams off my ship, honor the cooling period, and we can discuss this like civilized members of the Assembly. Or you can continue this repossession and find out exactly why my government spent the last 3 centuries keeping our most unclassified technology in the one place your intelligence agencies never bothered to scan. The room was so quiet that the hum of the air scrubbers sounded like a hurricane. Thalarin looked at his display, where the Sol System pulse was growing faster, louder, and more complex. What is that signal? Thalarin demanded, his voice barely a whisper now. That, Elena said, a ghost of a smile touching her lips, is the sound of you losing the vote. The display on the main dais turned blood red. The red light pulsing across the main dais turned the chamber into a slaughterhouse of data. Every delegate's personal display was now vomiting code, raw, unchecked, and fundamentally human. It wasn't an attack. It was a file dump. What is this? The Tashi delegate shrieked, its compound eyes darting across the scrolling lines of cascading equations. This is unauthorized. This is a breach of the Assembly's core network. Elena stood, her movements slow, deliberate, the calm center of storm that was tearing the hegemony's reputation to shreds. It's not a breach, Chancellor. It's an appendix, a forgotten annex of the founding compact that your intelligence office conveniently omitted from the digital records. Vera, if you would. Vera Vance stepped forward, her voice projected by the dais, resonating with the finality of a judge passing sentence. The Sol system isn't being reclassified, Chancellor. It's being liberated. Annex 9, subsection 3, is predicated on the Unclaimed Asset Clause. That clause only applies to species that cannot demonstrate a continuous, verified chain of technological sovereignty. We just pinged every hegemony receiver in the sector with the original, hard-coded digital signature of our first colony ship, dated 400 years before the hegemony even discovered fire. 3 decks below, Reyes was holding on to a bulkhead that was beginning to feel like wet clay. The nanite mist wasn't just on the drones. It was migrating. The Kestrel Vigil was shedding its skin. Great sheets of hardened hegemony alloy were peeling away, curling back like burnt paper, exposing the ship's true skeleton underneath. A frame reinforced with something that didn't look like metal. It looked like obsidian glass, glowing with a faint, internal, rhythmic pulse. Colonel, Reyes said, his voice straining against the sudden, violent vibration of the ship. The deck is becoming translucent. I can see the docking ring. Don't look down, Adeyemi replied. The colonel was standing at the bridge console, his eyes locked on the hegemony's flagship through the main viewport. The nanites are finishing the first pass of the alloy stripping. Now comes the part where they realize they didn't just breach a ship. They breached a container. A container for what? For a ghost, Adeyemi whispered. Above them, on the Kestrel Vigil's outer hull, the hegemony's boarding party began to scream. It wasn't biological sound. It was a screech of feedback, of synthetic processors being forced to interpret a signal they were never designed to handle. They weren't dying. They were being rewritten. In the assembly hall, Chancellor Thallerin was trembling so hard his robes rattled. He wasn't looking at the display anymore. He was looking at Elena. You didn't hide a fleet. You hit a frequency. You've been broadcasting a localized reality distortion field from the moment you docked. We call it the quiet fire, Elena said, her voice dropping to a register that carried throughout the hushed hall. It doesn't shoot, Chancellor. It doesn't explode. It simply suggests to the universe that your technology doesn't work the way you think it does. Thallerin lunged for his comm link, his face twisted in a mask of primal, unadulterated fear. Destroy the ship. All units. Ignore the protocol. Vaporize the Kestrel Vigil. The assembly hall erupted. The Tashi delegate stood up, its mandibles clicking in a rapid, aggressive cadence. Unauthorized engagement. Chancellor, by the laws of your self-enforce, you have just forfeited your seat. The hegemony flagship, the finality, finally fired. A massive, concentrated blast of kinetic energy lands toward the Kestrel Vigil. It should have turned the ship into dust. But the blast didn't hit. 3 meters from the Kestrel's hull, the energy simply curled. It swirled into a vortex, absorbed by the air itself, and vanished into the quiet fire that now engulfed the entire sector. Silence fell absolute and crushing. The Kestrel Vigil drifted, its skin now translucent, revealing the flickering, rhythmic heart of a ship that wasn't supposed to exist. You should have checked the footnote. Chancellor, Elena said softly. The one about who actually built this ring. Thalarin stared at the viewport, his eyes wide, his throat sac sagging. The finality wasn't firing anymore. The flagship was beginning to peel. The same Nanite mist that had dissolved the drones was now drifting toward the massive obsidian hull of the Hegemony's Pride. It's not a ship, Thalarin whispered, the terror finally breaking his voice. It's a trigger. The finality wasn't just losing its skin, it was losing its mind. On the bridge of the flagship, the tactical displays weren't showing enemy positions anymore. They were showing the ship's own internal architecture being remapped by the quiet fire. High Chancellor Thalarin stood paralyzed as his command console shifted from obsidian to a translucent, pulsating amber, the same signature now radiating from the Kestrel Vigil. Chancellor. A subordinate screamed, but the voice died in his throat as his own synthetic vocal processors began to emit the same rhythmic pulse as the ship. The logic cores, they're refusing to execute the self-destruct command. The system, it thinks we're an extension of a human vessel. Thalarin clawed his robes, his four throat sacs inflating and deflating in a frantic, desperate rhythm. Override the core, manually purge the neural link. We can't, the subordinate wailed. The link is rejecting our biometrics. It says we are unauthorized intruders. 3 decks below on the Kestrel, Reyes braced himself against a wall that felt like warm glass. The ship had stopped groaning. It was humming, a low, resonant frequency that seemed to vibrate in his very marrow. Colonel, Reyes shouted over the pulsing hum. The drones are gone. They're part of the deck plates now. And the finality, it's stopping. It's not just stopping fire. It's drifting toward us like it's being pulled by a magnet. Adeyemi stood at the primary relay, his hands hovering over an interface that looked more like an organ keyboard than a computer. He wasn't typing. He was playing the frequency. It's not drifting, Reyes. It's being harvested. Harvested? The quiet fire doesn't just destroy, Adeyemi said, his eyes fixed on the display, where the finality's obsidian hull was literally being pulled into the Kestrel's translucent skeleton. It recycles. It's taking their processing power, their fuel, their very reality-anchoring anchors, and feeding them into our grid. We aren't fighting them. We're consuming them. Up in the assembly hall, the red data scrolling stopped. The screens cleared, revealing a live feed of the finality, or what was left of it. It was shrinking, folding inward as if it were being squeezed by a giant, invisible hand. Chancellor, Elena said, her voice cutting through the hall like a surgeon's scalpel. You mentioned that possession becomes law faster than law becomes law. It seems the universe has decided to apply that logic to your flagship. Thalarin fell back into his chair, his robes dragging on the floor like a shroud. This is impossible. You are a biological species. You are finite. You are entropic decay. You cannot possess the hegemony. We aren't possessing you, Chancellor, Varavan said, her eyes tracking the shrinking silhouette of the flagship on the main display. We're just reclaiming the space you were occupying. The Annex 9 clause doesn't just apply to assets. It applies to founding compact space. And as of 3 minutes ago, the Assembly has recognized the Kestrel Vigil as a sovereign diplomatic entity, an entity that has just successfully defended itself against an act of piracy. The delegates in the hall gasped. The massive flagship, the pride of the hegemony, had been reduced to a glowing, shimmering orb of data matter, now tethered to the Kestrel Vigil by a single, thin beam of amber light. It's not a weapon, Thalarin whispered, his eyes hollow. It's a black hole for logic. It's a reset button, Elena corrected. And we're just getting started. The Tashi delegate leaned forward, its compound eyes now burning with new, terrifying realization. Ambassador Voss, Does this quiet fire affect other vessels? If, say, the hegemony were to attempt to mobilize its full fleet? Elena didn't answer immediately. She looked at Thalarin, who was watching the ore of his flagship being absorbed into the Kestrel's hull. The quiet fire, Elena said, her voice dangerously quiet, is a local phenomenon. But like any fire, it depends on the fuel it's given. The more logic and reality anchors the hegemony brings to bear, the brighter it burns. Thalarin realized then that he wasn't just losing a ship. He was losing the ability to ever fight humanity again, because every ship he sent would simply become more fuel for fire. High Chancellor Thalarin did not move. He did not scream. He simply sat in the dais, a hollowed-out shell of a dictator, watching the display where his flagship, the greatest achievement of the hegemony, had been reduced to a flickering data artifact in the hold of a human salvage ship. "You have destroyed the foundation of the hegemony," Thalarin said. His voice was not the booming command of Chancellor. It was the raspy, dry rattle of a man realizing he was the last of his kind. "You have not won a war. You have unmade the reality that supported our civilization. What comes next is not a new order. It is a vacuum." Elena Voss walked to the edge of the dais, the light of the amber orb reflecting in her eyes. "We didn't destroy your reality, Chancellor. We just reminded you that the universe is not a computer program to be optimized. You spent 300 years trying to delete the noise. You forgot that the noise is where the life is." 3 decks below, on the Kestrel Vigil, Sergeant Reyes watched the bridge console. The nanite cloud was retracting, receding into the ship's hull as if it were exhaling. The finality was gone, replaced by a dense, shimmering core of raw data that now powered the Kestrel systems. "Colonel," Reyes asked, his voice steady for the first time in hours. "The energy core, it's stable. It's actually feeding the life support." Adeyemi didn't look back. He was looking at the long-range scanners, where the hegemony's reinforcing fleet was turning around, their warp signatures sputtering and failing as the quiet fire ripple hit them. "It isn't just stable, Reyes. It's learning. Every ship they send, every bit of logic they try to impose on us, the ship records, deconstructs, and adds to our repertoire. We aren't a target anymore. We're the new baseline." "Ambassador," the Tashi delegate said, its voice trembling. "The Assembly Registry, it's changing. The hegemony's territorial claims, their trade pacts, their authority, it's all showing as null. Every single record is being overwritten. It's not an overwrite," Vera Vance said from behind Elena. "It's a correction. We're just restoring the original parameters of the founding compact. The ones at Thalarin's office thought they could optimize away." Thalarin stood up, his robes trailing behind him like a broken shadow. He looked at the delegates, the same delegates who had cheered for the annexation of Earth an hour ago. Now, they were cowering, terrified of the woman who had brought a mirror to a gunfight and won. "You are not heroes," Thalarin spat, his final words echoing in the chamber. "You are just a more efficient monster." "Maybe," Elena said, her voice devoid of triumph, only a cold, hard finality. "But we're the kind of monster that knows how to read the fine print." She turned, her stride measured and firm. As she walked out of the assembly hall, the lights dimmed, not because of a power failure, but because the Kestrel Vigil had finished its harvest. The hegemony was no longer an empire. It was a footnote in a library that humanity had just finished rewriting. The galaxy was no longer theirs to optimize. It was ours to inhabit. And as Ambassador Elias Thorne sat on the bridge of the Kestrel Vigil, watching the stars flicker as the quiet fire faded into a dull, satisfied glow, he knew one thing for certain. The Council had made their choice. They had voted against the wrong world.